Welcome to today's webinar, Equity in Policy and Practice, Addressing Past Inequities and Planning for the Future, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning with the American Planning Association and in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our new e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Equity in Policy and Practice, Addressing Past Inequities in Planning for the Future. You can also search for event number 9215329. So to get started, we are pleased to be joined today by Susan Wood, Jay Renkens, Leigh Anne King, and Alysia Osborne. Susan A. Wood is a planning project manager for the Denver Regional Transportation District, where she oversees project clearance and compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act. She has 14 years of experience in transit planning, following more than 10 years in land use planning for local governments in the Denver area. Within APA, she serves as the board director for Region 5 on the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and on the Legislative and Policy Committee, where she co-chaired APA's Planning for Equity Policy Guide. Previously, she served on the Chapter President's Council, Executive Committee, and the Social Equity Task Force. For APA Colorado, Susan serves on the Legislative Committee and is a past president of the chapter, and she joined the AICP College of Fellows in 2020. Jay Renkens of MIG is a planning and design leader with more than 15 years of national experience in comprehensive planning, transit-oriented development, and urban design. He has successfully led projects from high-level vision to implementation by facilitating client, community, and stakeholder collaboration, consensus, and engagement. He holds a Master of Urban Planning and Regional Planning from Portland State University, a Master of Health Psychology from Purdue, and bachelor's degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Leigh Anne King is director in Clarion's Chapel Hill, North Carolina office and leads its East Coast planning practice. She has worked with local governments for more than 20 years to develop sustainable community plans, affordable housing studies, growth management strategies, and open space planning initiatives. Leigh Anne was the lead author of 8 award-winning plans in the Carolinas. She speaks regularly at national and state conferences on the topics of comprehensive and strategic planning, affordable workforce housing, and other planning topics. She serves as co-chair for the APA North Carolina chapter's Affordable Housing Task Force, and before joining Clarion, she worked for a national land conservation nonprofit. Alysia Osborne is a division manager and assistant director in the City of Charlotte's Planning, Design, and Development Department. She is also the project manager for the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan, Charlotte's first comprehensive plan in almost 50 years. Alysia has more than 20 years of public and private sector experience. Prior to returning to the public sector in December 2019, she was Vice President of Planning and Development for Charlotte's Downtown Business Improvement District, where she managed a $1.5 million grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation to strategically guide equitable growth and development in the historic West End, Charlotte's oldest African-American neighborhoods. Following their presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And with that, we are going to launch our typical poll for those who've joined us before, just kind of asking where you're from today. It's always interesting for us, for the panelists, and probably for the audience members as well. It's always interesting to see where people are coming from. So we'll leave this open for about 30 seconds or so. If you're having trouble responding to the poll, you may need to exit from full screen mode. And occasionally, if we are changing presenters, although we'll only be doing that twice today, you may need to refresh your browser to see this in webcast mode. We'll leave this open for a couple more seconds, and then I'm going to turn it over to Susan. And thanks to everybody for participating. Looks like most people are. So today, 35% are from the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, 23% from the West, 22% from the South, 15% from the Midwest, and 4% international. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
With us. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning for some of you. It's so nice to have all of you here, and it's so nice to see that there are people from across the country for this presentation on the Planning for Equity Policy Guide, but really more importantly, talking about implementation of those policies. We have a great example from Charlotte, North Carolina that's going to be presented today, as well as going over some of the contents of the policy guide, so you will have it as a resource to use. Before we get started, though, we have another couple of polls we'd like to ask you. So maybe we can go ahead and start with poll number 1, which is, have you incorporated equity into any aspects of your planning program? So a yes or no. And we'll give a short time for you to answer.
And again, if folks are having trouble responding, you may need to exit from full screen mode. We are seeing the number of people coming in, so looking forward to sharing the results of this. We'll give you a couple more seconds. Looks like most people have already responded. And in this case, we have an interesting split of 75% yes and 25% no.
And I think that is a wonderful answer, and it's really great to hear that because it shows the awareness and the focus on equity, and it's really good to see that high of a number. Okay, we have one more poll question for you here, number 2, and that is, where have you incorporated equity in your planning programs?
And again, thanks to everybody who's voting. If you need to exit, hopefully you're not having any trouble responding. It looks like we're getting about an 80% response rate, so that's good. Give everybody a few seconds to respond. And you, in this case, can select all that apply. We'll just leave it open another second or two. Looks like it'll be quite an interesting split. So in this case, 56% specialty plans, including transportation, neighborhood, open space, 37% in comprehensive plans, 36% in other categories, and 11% both in zoning ordinances and through equity audits.
Very good. It's really nice to see that equity is being applied in a number of areas. And in fact, again, it's just really so encouraging and so nice to see this. And thank you for your answers. And I think we'll go ahead and get started with talking about APA's policy guides. And just to give a little overview of what they are, many know what they are, not everyone does. APA, through their Legislative and Policy Committee, has created a number of guides over the last couple of decades, actually, and right now has about 25 policy guides in place. The Planning for Equity Policy Guide is a really new guide. It was approved by the APA Board of Directors in 2019, and hence why we're moving into implementation. And it looks like we really are, which is great. The policy guides really does state APA's official position on policy matters, on all planning matters that are covered in the guide, and also sets the policy for members, not only just the organization, but members and planners as well. Ideally, they're intended to be a great tool for planners to use, not only to educate, but also to influence and to create great communities. Next slide. So the equity definition that's used in the Planning for Equity Policy Guide is the same equity definition that PolicyLink uses. And it's a very nice one, but there are a lot of good ones out there. But it's just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, unlocking the promise of the nation by unleashing the promise in us all. I think the key word there, though, is fair, because I don't think you'll see an equity definition anywhere that doesn't include fairness or fair in the definition. That really is at the heart of equity. The graphic that you see on the screen, many of you have probably seen as well, but it never hurts to reemphasize this, that equal and equality is not the same as equity. Equality is simply equal shares, where equity is providing communities and people what they need in order to have an even footing. So equal and equity are not the same. Next slide. There is an inextricable link between planning, though, and equity, in the same way as we say employing principles of sustainability means doing good planning, or using smart growth principles means doing good planning. Applying equity policies and principles also means good planning. And this means really centering people first, looking at people first and outcomes second. Also, good planning and linking planning to equity means taking a holistic approach where you look at all potential outcomes, whether they be positive outcomes or whether they be negative impacts, using that trite phrase, an equity lens. It is a trite phrase, but it has a big meaning behind it. And what it really means is looking at all aspects of the work that we do as planners, either in doing maybe development review or in working with the community to create a comprehensive plan or a transportation plan or other, looking at that from the aspect of how it affects all people in the community and to address it. You know, and going through time, and most of you have probably had this as well, planners really want to make a difference. That's what's important, and equity is one way to do it. So the policy guide presents ways to make a difference, and it presents the case for why that's important. Planning for equity does matter. We all know that disparities exist between members in our communities, and those disparities have existed for some time. And this past year, we've really seen how great those disparities are and how important it is for all of us to address equity. It really does matter. We need to bridge the gap between in access to opportunity, because we need all our community members for their benefit and for our community benefits. Planners have a real role to play here as well. We're often the first line of contact with members of the community. We're the ones that are going out to community meetings and talking with community members. We're hearing their issues, their concerns, and their desires. So we're really uniquely positioned to be able to convey that information to decision makers. Aside from that, we have powerful tools. Zoning is a legal tool. It's a powerful tool. So are comprehensive plans, because they set the vision for the community with input from the community. So we should never lose sight that we are in a great position to address equity. Next slide. So the Planning for Equity Policy Guide establishes that equity is something that we should practice as planners as a hard skill, not just something we want to do, but something that we actually put in practice. It confirms that equity should be at the core of all planning policies, and it makes the case for equity by providing a historical context for equity and planning and equity. Next slide. So the policy guide is structured really into sort of three main areas. The first is the introductory section, which really makes the case for planning for equity and the role that planners play. The second one introduces cross-cutting issues, which really are something that we should consider as planners in all the work that we do when we're considering equity. And that those three areas are gentrification, environmental justice, and community engagement. And we're going to be focusing on those quite a bit today as we go through the example and the work that's been done in Charlotte. And then also the third section really gives actionable policy recommendations across a wide range of discrete topical areas in areas that planners often work in. It's not exhaustive. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a good start. Next slide. So ideally, the outcomes from this effort and from the policy guide itself is that planners will begin to use an equity in all policies approach. And that, again, goes back to the equity lens and looking holistically at the positive and negative impacts of the work that we do and how that affects individuals and communities. Also, the policy guide is intended to provide a tool and a resource for planners to use so that they can educate other planners, educate allied professionals, educate community members, and also elected officials, and in doing so, be able to influence the outcomes based on being able to influence decision makers. Also, the policy guide is intended to initiate implementation, which is where we are. And again, I think we have a great start toward that. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, it's intended to address inequities that we have and create more equitable communities. Next slide. So just going over the sections a little bit in the guide, the introductory section does set the historical context for why planners are equipped to address equity and really why we need to. It talks about the role that planners have played in some of the past inequities that occurred in the early and mid 20th century. And of course, we all know this, talking about redlining, exclusionary zoning, exclusionary covenants, and some others. Most of these are illegal today, but the effects of them continue. Those areas that were redlined continue to be areas that are not as invested in, and therefore they haven't kept pace with areas around them. It's our responsibility to know this and address this. We do have an ethical responsibility. It's in our AICP Code of Ethics and the principles to which we aspire. But I think we probably also all agree that this ethical charge should be more than aspirational. It's something that we're required to do. Again, more than aspirational. Also included in the guide is a section that addresses diversity and inclusion in the planning profession. I think we all know that as a profession, we are not as diverse, certainly as we could be. Some areas of the country may be more so than others, but it's something that we should strive to do, because to have a complete range of perspectives in the work that we do will ultimately give us a better planning product and will also serve our communities better. Next slide. So again, the Planning for Equity Policy Guide really presents an equity in all policies approach, again, so that we incorporate equity into all facets of planning that we do. This is true in both the cross-cutting areas that we talked about, gentrification, environmental justice, and community engagement, but it's also true in the topical areas. And in both the cross-cutting areas and the topical areas, there are actionable policies that are presented. Next slide. So we're really going to start with the cross-cutting issues and really focus in talking about the work in Charlotte on gentrification, environmental justice, and community engagement and empowerment, but also we'll be touching on, next slide, on the topical areas as well. And again, these are the topical areas that are included in the policy guide. There are many more, I'm sure, that could be added. Infrastructure is one that comes to mind for me, but this covers much of the work that we do as planners. Again, there are actionable policies for the topical areas and for the cross-cutting areas as well. And with that, so that we can get down to talking about a great example of implementation, I'm going to turn it over to Jay Renkens with MIG.
Great, thank you, Susan. So we're really fortunate to be actually leading the team that is working with staff, the community, elected and appointed officials in developing the first comprehensive plan for Charlotte that has been developed in well over 40 years at this point. For those of you who have not been tracking along with Charlotte's growth over the last decade or so, it's actually one of the fastest growing communities in the country. By all accounts, you kind of using typical measures of success, square footage, new jobs, growth in different industries and sectors, attracting millennials, tech jobs and that sort of thing. Charlotte has been extremely successful, particularly coming out of the Great Recession. But when we first saw the solicitation for this effort, I was excited. I had worked in Charlotte previously, and I knew it was a great community with great people. But already in that framing stage and in sort of making the ask and soliciting proposals to do the work, the project was being framed through this equity lens. And Amanda Gorman, I think, said it especially well. For while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. There was a magnifying glass being put on the community, and the inequities and disparities across the community were becoming much more pronounced as growth was accelerating, as certain areas, certain people were seeing investment and others were not. And so Susan touched on the impacts of redlining, many other regulatory sort of practices, banking practices, lending practices. This is very pronounced in Charlotte. Areas that were redlined tend to be those areas, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but tend to be the areas where people of color are living, people of lower incomes, lower education. And maybe most shocking is that upward mobility is a continual challenge in these areas where practices may have been implemented 100+ years ago, but someone who's born into poverty today has less than a 20% chance of getting out of poverty, within their lifetime within the city of Charlotte. And so urban renewal contributed to that as well. This is one of the more visible examples, the Brooklyn neighborhood within uptown of Charlotte, which is what Charlotte calls its downtown area, a really vibrant, primarily Black neighborhood that was wiped away for urban renewal. And, lush green lawns and, for sort of in the name of progress, but, an entire vibrant district community was, wiped out. And so one of the things that we needed to do, and really prompted again by the staff primarily at the front end of this process, was thinking about what does an equity lens look like. And it's interesting when you think about the different types of plans, and there was the poll at the beginning here. A comprehensive plan is generally made of elements, and so there's different topics. And the original idea was, well, we'll have an equity element. But we knew that it needed to go much deeper than that in integrating equity throughout the entire planning process, as well as into all elements of our comprehensive plan. And so what we're showing here is a series of maps, some of which were developed actually prior to our team being involved. Some came out of the work that we had done in the front end of the process, but looking at segregation by wealth, segregation by income, of poverty on the other end of the spectrum, and then race and ethnicity. And what you can see is a general pattern, which locally has been called the arc and the wedge. And so basically sort of starting in the center of the community in Uptown, heading south is the wedge, which tends to be white, affluent, well-educated. And the arc, the western portion of the community, north and east, is made up of lower income neighborhoods and Black communities, people of color. What is I think really interesting, and Susan started to tease this out a bit, is not only have those areas not really received what they needed, in terms of sort of really applying the equity lens, but they've also not even received the level of investment as everybody else. So not only have we fallen short in terms of equity, but equality. There has been a lot of missteps over the decades. And so the last year has, put an even greater lens on this. We started the process, I think, approximately 3 years ago, or nearly 3 years ago. And the incidents of last spring and, through to present day have, again, pronounced these, put a magnifying glass. COVID, as I think in a lot of your own communities, probably pronounced a lot of these disparities. And then political polarization has not helped either. Charlotte, for those of you who maybe were not tracking last summer, fall time, was supposed to host the Republican National Convention, and ultimately former President Trump's campaign pulled out. But we've seen polarization at the state level, at the local level, despite all the smiling faces in the photo here, around different topics where, at a high level we agree, but when it comes down to the nuts and bolts and, how it is applied on the ground, there's some challenges that we're still facing. So our team took an approach in Charlotte that really integrated equity in all phases and all tasks. Again, thinking about this as a, purely a cross-cutting theme or a vision element, or maybe having an element, a chapter of the document that would touch on equity, we didn't feel like was enough, particularly given how deep a lot of these wounds are and the scars that the community has. And so it had to be part of our process of existing conditions. You'll hear from Alysia later about community and stakeholder engagement, integrating this into our vision and goal setting and development of all of our other aspects of the comprehensive plan. So we set out to measure what we care about. If we continue to do business as usual, we're going to end up with the same results. We felt as though starting at the very get-go and thinking about sort of how do we approach an existing conditions kind of phase of the process, we needed to start, changing how we were thinking about different aspects of this. So we actually, instead of a standard existing conditions report, we actually created 3 distinct documents: a Built City Equity Atlas, a policy audit report, and a growth factors report. We're going to touch on the equity atlas really quickly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Leigh Anne to talk about the policy audit. But the growth factors report too is of note in looking at how growth was, happening very intensely, and a lot of times in areas that were, not well represented in political conversations and planning efforts. And so the benefits were very unequal, the impacts were very unequal. Affordability across the country with our housing crisis is becoming even more pronounced of an issue. But that also then started to show up in these other 2 elements that we looked at. So the equity atlas, really simply put, I just have a couple of slides here and then I'll turn it over to Leigh Anne. But really started to explore this differentiation between the arc and the wedge. And where we had these, sort of communities of color and concentrated poverty, we wanted to see what were the real differences. And there were some surprises. We were seeing that, where was most different was, where displacement was happening, or the vulnerability displacement, job skills match. So typically people in the arc were having to travel much greater distances for employment or taking employment that didn't necessarily match up with their skills. The level of investment in residences, size of commercial space, and then all those other factors. But job density was one that really kind of jumped out as well. The wedge not only had, or has, predominantly, white, affluent, well-educated folks, but also has the vast majority of employment for the community, particularly higher wage jobs and other jobs of that type. And then we also looked at, these other types of differences, and it was interesting. Different aspects started to not, or actually sort of highlight, such as sidewalks, where we had sidewalks and where we did not. There wasn't a big difference, honestly, between the arc and the wedge, similar to, a typical measure of, using a 10-minute walk lens for parks. We were actually seeing very little difference between the arc and the wedge, but when we did a deeper dive and looked at not just that high level quantitative approach, but also started to think about the quality of those spaces and amenities. That's where we really started to see the difference. The sidewalks, may have been put in at the exact same time in, say, the west part of Charlotte and the south part of Charlotte, but they had never been revisited in West Charlotte, whereas South Charlotte, they may have been improved, a couple times over the last several decades. So taking that kind of deeper look, not relying just on the data, but measuring what we cared about was extremely important in setting the framework up.
Great. So when we initiate a planning process, we need to begin with being honest about where the community is starting from. As Maya told us, we can't really know where we're going until we know where we've been. Next slide. For Charlotte Future 2040, looking at where the city had been and included a look at the data and trends like Jay just showed us, but it also included a look at existing policy direction. That's what I'm going to talk about today, is the comprehensive plan policy audit that was prepared for Charlotte. This effort was one of the first steps in laying the groundwork to prepare the new comprehensive plan. And the intent was really to create an honest accounting of the city's current policy direction included in myriad plans. It laid out all the existing planning policies for the city in an easy to access way. And it was a good jumping off point to understand where progress needed to be made. Next slide. We started the process by identifying the objectives for the policy audit project, of which there were 4. And the first one, again, was to really synthesize all of the community-wide policies that were out there. We looked at more than 30 plans that were applied citywide. They were small area plans and county plans to create a common understanding of what that direction is out there that's guiding the city's decision makers and staff today. Secondly, we wanted to organize using a community planning topic framework with a focus on equity and inclusivity. And you can see that framework listed on the slide there. So we wanted to understand what the community's values and vision were across these plans. And then we had several topical themes: livable and connected city, inclusive city, healthy and resilient city, prosperous and innovative city, and regional city. Next slide. So when we reviewed these 30+ plans, we looked at all the planning topics. The words that you see on the screen here are representative of the topics that the project team looked for when they were reviewing each of these plans. And it was very comprehensive, it was very time intensive, but it was really worth the effort to understand what the policy direction was in established plans within the community. As Jay was talking about, it's been almost 40 years since the city has established a comprehensive plan or developed a new one. And so a lot of plans were made in that time frame. And we needed to go through and understand what each of these plans were telling us. You all are probably familiar and maybe have experienced this in your community, where there was a long period of time where planning was much more focused on area plans. And what I think a lot of communities realized over the last decade or so is that these area plans weren't knit together. And that's where their comprehensive planning process really helps to understand how all these pieces fit together. And that was what we were trying to accomplish in this audit. Next slide. So in looking at all of these topics, we did want to have a clear focus on equity and inclusivity. And as you can see, the words on the screen here that are highlighted in green, these are those cross-cutting and specific planning topics that Susan mentioned are included in the Planning for Equity Policy Guide. So we did take a look at those. Next slide. And then the final 2 objectives for the audit were to, 1, rank the policy maturity. So in saying that, we mean how established is this policy direction within the community? And we wanted to find a positive way to express the status of policy and focus on a path forward. Everyone loves a house plant. And so we went with the idea that we can start something and watch it grow. So we have policy seeds that have been planted. They're kind of at their early stages, policies that have taken root, and well-established policies. And as part of that, we were also looking at policy gaps. We wanted to understand, where can the city be doing more? And then the final objective that we had was to capture staff's input on policy effectiveness and the relationship to implementation. We used that information later when we began developing the policy framework for the actual plan. It's important to point out that we were very disciplined in this audit and looking at policy, not implementation actions. We were really specifically looking at the guidance for decision making, but we also wanted to, as part of that conversation, pick up ideas and put them in the sandbox for later in terms of implementation that we might want to be discussing in the effort. Next slide. So there were 4 key steps to do this. The first was developing that organizational framework I showed on a previous slide. The second was actually reviewing the policies and categorizing them in our database and identifying those policy gaps where there are opportunities. The third was asking staff to weigh through everything and apply their effectiveness rating to the policies and confirm the gaps that had been identified. And then fourth, we really themed and synthesized all the information into the final report. Next slide. So I'm going to focus on the inclusive city theme. As shown previously, we looked at the full array of issues identified in the APA Equity and Planning Policy Guide. The items highlighted in green on this chapter page were planning topics that the city was having active conversations with the broader community at that time. Keep in mind, this was 2018 really when it was being developed. I think we published it in January 2019. This was pre-Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Since the events of last year, many of the non-bolded issues have been front and center for the city as well. Next slide. So now I'm going to share how the policy audit work addressed the 3 cross-cutting equity issues that Susan described earlier, starting with gentrification. As the project team reviewed the plans to find policies that address gentrification and displacement, we identified 2 area plans and 1 county plan that included policies on this topic that generally supported strategies to prevent displacement of residents and to foster neighborhood dialogue on this topic. And the gap for exploration, the kind of recommendation for where we go from here, was to build off previous assessment work that had been undertaken by the city staff to evaluate gentrification. I believe it was in 2012, and also work they had done to develop locational guidelines for affordable housing. So building off that work, we recommended that they take a relook at that topic because it had been a few years, and maybe that data needed to be updated to better diagnose the problem and create a more robust policy to combat gentrification. Next slide. So moving on to environmental justice, we identified that none of the plans reviewed had policies that addressed this issue. And this was an important realization and provided a clear opportunity for the comprehensive plan to establish environmental justice and exposure policies. Next slide. We also looked at community engagement and empowerment. 2 area plans included policies related to this cross-cutting topic that supported cultivating neighborhood leaders, building capacity of neighborhood leaders, supporting neighborhood engagement and city initiatives, and investing in disadvantaged communities. For the policy gap, we identified an opportunity to build off the Charlotte City Council's October 2016 letter to the community. This letter was in response to the 3-day protest in Charlotte that was a reaction to Keith Lamont Scott's shooting. The letter addressed trust in community policing, quality affordable housing, good jobs and the skills to get them, and other opportunities as a starting point for developing a community-wide dialogue to support engagement and empowerment, particularly for disadvantaged communities. Next slide. As we were preparing this report, it really became clear that these issues were coming to the forefront, not only in Charlotte, but for other communities across the nation as well. And identifying the areas that the city could strengthen its policies related to equity and inclusivity, there was an opportunity for it to be a model for other communities on this issue. Now I'll hand it back to Susan to talk about the cross-cutting issues.
Susan, you need to unmute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. So the purpose of this is just to circle back to the policy guide as a resource and really to focus in on those cross-cutting areas that Leigh Anne just went through. And we'll start first with gentrification. Next slide. So gentrification, as we all know, underserved areas are those that are truly ripe for reinvestment and as a result, ripe for gentrification. Gentrification in and of itself, though, isn't necessarily a bad thing. We want to see investments in our communities in order to bring all communities and all members of those communities up. The problem is the negative effects that can come with gentrification, most notably displacement and loss of affordable housing. So it's important to be proactive and recognize when gentrification can occur and to take measures to avoid that. Next slide. So some of the policies that are included in the Planning for Equity Policy Guide include taking a comprehensive approach to mitigation. And again, this means looking at all aspects of what can happen, what the impacts can be, what the effects can be, and then employing whatever tools we have available to us and being creative to come up with new tools as well to prevent that displacement or to encourage keeping affordable housing or creating affordable housing. The second policy is conducting a social impact assessment. This is very similar, but it may be a more methodological approach, and that is to, again, look at all of those impacts and aspects of redevelopment and gentrification, including the negative ones, so that we can address them. And then in doing so, encourage equitable development as a solution and a way to go forward. And I think I'm turning it over to Jay at this point.
Yep, thank you, Susan. So in order to apply these different cross-cutting themes and policy direction from the policy guide, in our effort, we really felt it was important to integrate equity all the way through, from vision through implementation. So in our vision and goals section of the document, which would be our kind of section 1 of the draft plan, we introduce an equitable growth framework. So defining what equitable development means in Charlotte, and then beginning to actually, again, kind of use measurement and metric to identify those areas of greatest need, of areas that are doing well, maybe in one category, but not another. And so ultimately, we framed it as having this vulnerability displacement overlay, looking at education, income, race, ethnicity, as an overlay across 4 other equity metrics. So you can see those on the screen here, but related to access to amenities, goods, and services, housing opportunity, employment opportunity, and then importantly, environmental justice, which I'll reserve for our next cross-cutting theme topic. The vulnerability displacement index aligns extremely well, if you recall from those maps in the earlier map, or in the earlier part of the discussion around the arc and the wedge in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so the vulnerability to displacement index sort of was an overlay that was put over these different aspects. And I won't read through each of these, but each metric, in essence, it's actually an index. And so it includes somewhere between 5 and 8 different measurable pieces of data. Here it's proximity to amenities, goods, and services. So there was a large community conversation about, without getting into the, we just want to provide equal, amenities everywhere. What are those critical elements to make a complete community, and where should those go? And then thinking about housing opportunity, we tried to really be broad and inclusive in sort of thinking about this in terms of tenure, the level of reinvestment, subsidized housing, but also the types of housing that are available. Employment, similarly, with job density, we thought about people getting 2 jobs, looking at wage levels, and then also middle skill and knowledge-based jobs. And so all of that played into framing up the creation of these complete and equitable communities. One aspect of that, which is if you get a chance to look at the draft plan, is articulated in section 2, which is around this idea of using places to create complete communities, and this idea that all areas of the community should not look the same, feel the same. They should be distinct, and we should celebrate culture and the history of places and look at differences, but that they all should have at their core access to work, live, and play opportunities. When we get into section 3 of the plan, which is articulating goals and policy recommendations, I just wanted to highlight a few here. And so first goal is about the 10-minute neighborhoods. Depending on the community, you may have something similar. 15-minute neighborhoods have been talked about, 20-minute neighborhoods, 10-minute neighborhoods. So here we're talking about walking, biking, and transit access, that with using those 3 modes, you should have access to essential goods, service, and amenities within 10 minutes. The trick is that it's not just private investment that contributes to gentrification. It can be public investment too, either directly or as a cue to the private sector of where to invest, whether that's a family deciding where to purchase a home and maybe fix it up, and maybe it's a developer deciding where they want to purchase a property or improve a property. So we needed to really think about what are those tools and mechanisms, like community benefits agreements, for instance, that could actually, where we could invest in those communities that, in the ways that they needed, and not necessarily contribute to gentrification and displacement ultimately. So how can the people living there and working there, owning businesses, be a part of the future of the place that they are in today? Next, we're looking at housing. We have 2 goals around housing. One is about diversity and inclusion of housing, and really thinking about what has historically been exclusionary single-family zoning. And we're actually in kind of the throes of this discussion with the community now, with council, the development community, different neighborhoods, what that looks like. And again, the intent is to create more housing options in more places, with kind of the macro effect of increasing supply, hopefully helping to curb, the lack of affordability. But similarly, people are concerned, and I think rightly so, that if we start to be too broad brush about this, we don't have tools to accompany some of the recommendations, that all too could lead to displacement. So we need to be thinking about intended and unintended consequences. Housing access for all is really about affordability. I wanted to call out the second big idea on the screen there, which is to create a robust program of restorative justice, targeting homeownership, creation and growth of small business and equity building for the Black community, including strategic application of existing tools. So Charlotte is doing a lot of good things already, but that can be more robust and can be more coordinated. And we felt as though, in working with the community, that it's important to call this out as a highlight in the plan. A couple more here, and I'll turn it back to Susan. Goal 5, it is so difficult, obviously, to remove or separate transportation and land use and development. And so that access component, particularly in, I think, in a southern sort of radial format, developed community, with interesting topography and developing at different times, mobility became a key aspect of how do we make our communities better? How do we create more equitable access to existing assets as well as new assets that are being planned? And then lastly here in this section is diverse and resilient economic opportunity. So actually thinking about planning and figuring out where we would do it, but new regional activity centers with a mix of jobs, housing in those areas that are least served. And then calling attention to the big idea at the bottom of the screen there, thinking about the fiscal impacts of the plan and how do we make a fiscally resilient future for Charlotte. One of the commitments is to direct at least half of the public infrastructure spending over the life of the plan to the most vulnerable communities. Susan?
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Again, circling back to the policy guide and really the second cross-cutting equity issue, which is environmental justice. Next slide. So again, a cross-cutting issue, environmental justice, which environmental justice, like equity, really has at its heart fairness and looking at avoiding disproportionate impact. If you look at the EPA definition, it says, refers to the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and incomes with respect to development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Again, the word fair appears, and that's, again, the heart of environmental justice, just as it is equity. Next slide. So these are the policies that are included in the Planning for Equity Policy Guide with regard to environmental justice. The first policy, encourage triple bottom line outcomes, really refers to going for the win-win. And if you can picture what we've all seen, the sustainability stool where we have environmental and economic and social justice, and think about environmental justice in terms of social justice, this really fits. Again, going for the triple bottom line outcomes in fairness to all. The second policy, give deference to local knowledge. This really talks to somewhat to even the other cross-cutting issue of community engagement, because it means to listen to people who live there, to listen to people who live it, and take that knowledge into account in order to adhere to environmental justice. The third policy, encourage collaborative problem solving, really talks about partnership. And this is partnership between local government, between nonprofits, elected officials, and certainly the community to address environmental justice issues. And then the fourth policy is pro bono planning efforts. You know, APA has done this, other organizations have done this, such as ULI, but efforts to assist underserved and under-resourced communities. This has also been done at the local level, again, with that eye toward fairness and environmental justice. And Jay, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Susan. So our fourth aspect of the equity metrics was environmental justice. I'm going to touch on this very quickly, very lightly. I'm happy to follow up with folks afterwards. I would encourage you to check out the plan, but just for the sake of time, we're going to touch this one a little lighter. But tree canopy being a really important component of Charlotte and its identity. A very lush tree canopy that is, quickly dissipating in certain areas because of development, but also looking at some major transportation and land use considerations, as well as floodplain, proximity to the airport, other nuisance impacts. And so we have two goals that hit on environmental justice really explicitly, but you'll see actually environmental justice woven throughout the plan. As well as in that approach to mapping of places across the community, in essence, sort of land use with this layering on of transportation, open space, and other impacts. And so environmental justice can be challenging for a relatively built out community. And so we needed to integrate this at all different scales, from the mapping of place types, which you're seeing as the highlighted policy in Goal 6, to thinking about different mechanisms and ways to address environmental justice in the highlighted policy in Goal 7. But ultimately, for implementation, I wanted to call out a couple of things before handing it back over to Susan. Looking at the equity metrics, we needed to identify places and amenities where there's gaps. We want to map place types. Ultimately, those will inform the zoning districts. And we want to do that through a community area planning process. It's great to have a community-wide conversation, but there's certain aspects, there's certain considerations, environmental justice being one of those, where we can map and look at the data and understand perhaps at a community-wide scale, but to actually sort of understand and come up with new solutions, we need to have more localized conversations. And so ultimately we want to ensure those costs and benefits are in fact equitable through a variety of tools. Susan?
All right, and now, thank you. This is Susan. Now to hit on the third cross-cutting issue of community engagement and empowerment, there really isn't one more important in the equity picture, one more important than this, certainly, because it means reaching out to all community members, but most of all, it means listening to those community members and giving them voice. Our role as planners enables us to take in that information and get the information to decision makers so that the community members have an opportunity to influence those decisions that are made. So there's a real need to make sure we use adequate outreach strategies in order to reach all community members, and that can be a wide variety of things that we employ. Next slide. These are policies that are included in the guide, among some others. One is institute principles of effective community engagement and utilize targeted community engagement strategies. And what this really means is one size doesn't fit all. you know, if the community has a lot of small children, then we need to have childcare at meetings. If we know that mealtime is a time when people can't attend, we need to organize meetings around that. We need to make sure that we have interpreters if that's needed, or other access methodologies. In other words, communities are not all the same, and we need to be sure that we use strategies that will engage the community that we're dealing with so that they can participate and, again, be empowered and really have a voice. Second policy, implement principles of participatory planning. Again, that's giving people voice and having their voice heard, not telling them what good planning is and what they need, but understanding from them what it is that they see as issues and what it is that they would like, and then making sure that those who can make the decisions regarding that have that information. Only in doing that do we build trust, and that's communication. And I'll turn it over to Alysia at this point.
Thanks, Susan, and I'll run through the slides pretty quickly, but folks can definitely reach out to ask questions. As you mentioned, a lot of the processes that we typically do in community engagement are fine during the process, but we had to think a little bit differently during COVID. It definitely presented some challenges. We had a lot of in-person meetings, and that one-on-one interaction was definitely not an option for the past year during the development of the plan, but it allowed us to be more creative in creating some platforms that we can continue to reach out to folks. So I'll talk about a few of those ideas, but we begin the process by, next slide, Jay. We begin the process by asking the question, who's not in the room? And always understanding that there are primary audiences within processes like this, your community, the elected appointed officials, staff, and your media. But the way we approach the plan for the process for the 2040 plan is that, you know, equitable engagement begins as an inside job. We talked to staff and made sure that our organization as a whole really took to heart and institutionalized equitable principles in everything that we do, not just engagement, but thinking about how we do work and serve the community. So that's what I mean by it's an inside job. You have to start first within, and then when you engage the community, it's more authentic and it's more equitable in how you do it. So that question about who's not in the room, you have to be real intentional too about asking that question, but measuring it. You can't change what you don't measure. So with each activity, we track and monitor who's in the room, what's the diversity of those participants, using survey tools to collect demographic data. And during COVID, we switched it a little bit and used our zip code data to make sure that we reached the audiences that we identified as target groups during the Equity Atlas work that Leigh Anne spoke about earlier. Next slide. And we wanted to make sure that we track that data and illustrate it at every meeting. So people knew that we were making sure that we had a diverse group of folks in the room, that folks like them were participating in the process, and that their engagement matters throughout this process. So these are some of the metrics that tools that we use in each meeting and in our engagement summaries that are on the website for each phase of the plan to make sure folks knew that their voice mattered. Next slide. So we use over 40 different methods to connect with Charlotteans, everything from the traditional workshops, community meetings, flyers and mailings, and other to creative techniques like TikTok challenges and coloring books and our drive-in community meeting. We had so many different tools to make sure that we met people where they are. We provided multiple options for times. In the daytime or for the evening crowd, we provided childcare, discount codes for Uber and Lyft, just trying to make it easier for people to participate and understanding that their voice matters in this process and making sure that we provide all the options that we could to help them be engaged. Next slide. A large part of our engagement was a 400 plus group of ambassadors and strategic advisors. They volunteered their time to be a sounding board for our work, to check us on, make sure that we were abiding by the guiding principles that were established at the beginning of the process, but also asking them to disseminate information to their neighbors, family, and friends. So they not only participated in the process, but they had a role in sharing that information. Next slide. So we created a ambassador toolkit for them to make it easy for them to take that information out to their neighborhood. Pre-made emails, social media posts, newsletters, graphics, and images, and just made it really easy for the ambassadors to take that accurate information out to the neighborhoods. Next slide. We also had a board game that we used in 2 big phases of the game. Initially, the board game was called Growing Better Places, that asked people to participate in a game that helped to develop the growth strategy. How do you want to see Charlotte grow over time? And so this game was used for that. We did another iteration of the game that used the policies and programs that in the equitable growth framework that Jay talked about to actually build the city. So each participant had the opportunity to use the content of the plan to build a city, and we gamified those elements. And here are the numbers to show some of our participation. We had an online version, a hard copy version, and it was offered in English and Spanish as well. Next slide. We also did some very distinct things to engage our youth. During COVID, a lot of our schools within the school system had a lunch program where students could pick up lunch. And so we worked with the local artists to create coloring sheets to include in those lunch boxes. We were able to distribute almost 2,000 of these coloring sheets, and folks would post their coloring sheets on social media to share about their future of Charlotte. Next slide. We also did the TikTok challenge that I mentioned before. It's called Imagine CLT. So each thing that we did on social media actually used this hashtag to make those connections. And what the challenge really was about, and a lot of kids participated, is what is the Charlotte that you want to see? And then using a North Carolina favorite song that, kind of is a nod to the history of the city in terms of that song, and then to post it on social media and share. So we received over 11,000 views during that challenge. Next slide. So we wanted to also not only just engage people in the process, but make sure that they had access to the document in a number of ways. We created an e-plan that made it really easy for people to view the document in sections, that could comment directly on the pages. Also a PDF version where people could print it, and also distributed hard copies in over 21 library locations around the city, and really gave people the options to comment on the draft plan online, through mail. They can send us an email, and if you're visually impaired, they could call our 311 call service and leave a message to leave comments on the draft document. But next slide, when we rolled out the document, we did a drive-in community meeting, which had over 500 participants, 4 sessions throughout the day. For those people who might be working earlier in the day, they could come later. And we ended that session with a movie, Back to the Future. Each participant could drive to various stations. You look at the picture below and look at key elements of the plan. Staff presented from a stage, and that you were able to view on large LED screens the presentation and use the elements of your car, the parts of your car to participate. You will use your windshield wipers if you agreed with something, your hazard lights if you had a question or something that you needed more information about, or you could just honk your horn if it's something you really liked about the plan. You could also text questions, and we answered them in real time during the presentation. We had a live Spanish translator on site, so the information was available in English and Spanish through a radio transmitter in your cars. Next slide. Another innovative tool that we used during this process was our virtual open house. This was something that we were really excited about, where people could view the elements of the plan 24/7 in over 100 languages So you would visit a station, you can click on images, meeting boards, and do surveys and watch quick videos about the plan. And this was really something that was accessible to folks that, you know, may not have the time to read our document or to make it to a meeting. In their spare time, they could actually use their phones or their desktops to view elements of the plan in this really cool 3D virtual experience. Next slide. And the last thing that I wanted to just share is that what was really key in the process is that we simplified the messaging. And I think our elected officials love this tool the most. It really provided an animated video that people can connect with, no matter how old you are or what your level of understanding is about planning. Something about animation that connects people to information. And so this was one of our most successful tools as well through this process to simplify why we're doing the plan, what's included in it, and how people can be involved in the process. And now I'll turn it back to, so my key takeaways. So key takeaways for the engagement. Again, I mentioned that equitable engagement starts with an inside job. The organization has to buy into what you're trying to do for it to be authentic and for it to just kind of exude through their various processes in your organization. Make sure you're establishing platforms and activities that can be evergreen within your toolbox, that you start something that you can continue to use. That provides consistency and predictability for people, that helps to build trust in the process in your department and all the work that you might do in your community. Track and monitor your activity to make sure that you know what you need to change or how to improve something, and share that information so folks can know that their voice matters and that you are making sure that you reach people where they are. And then embrace innovation to meet people where they are. Sometimes that means you have to break the rules, but you won't know until you try it, and then others can follow with that creativity within your organization.
Great.
I'll turn it back to Leigh Anne.
Yeah, thanks, Alysia. A couple of key takeaways on the policy audit work. We think it's really important to start with an honest accounting of where a community is starting from. It really helps to build faith and trust in the process, that we were being very clear, both on the policy side and also on the kind of data trends and kind of implications of previous decisions side as well that Jay shared. So the second point here is that it's really worth the effort to look comprehensively at a community's established policy direction. It's a lot of work. In fact, we started this process with a different project manager, and that person was a little dubious about the importance or efficacy of doing this policy audit. And I'm happy to say that they were very pleased with what came out at the end and realized that it was worth the effort, because it created a lot of good momentum to build upon. And everybody understood across the community where the city was with respect to basically every planning issue that we as planners deal with on a regular basis. And finally, it was important because it helped identify a path forward, a positive path forward. It wasn't just a look at what the policies in existence were, but it was how do we build on those? How do we make those better for the future, especially for areas where the community comes up short? And that really helped to start the momentum for change.
Great. Just a couple quick takeaways from me. This is Jay. I think applying an equity lens, it really cannot be an afterthought. And so, you know, when you're scoping your project, when you're thinking about who's going to be involved, designing your engagement strategy, it really needs to sort of start at the very beginning, both from, you know, sort of the grassroots level as well as from top down. Exploring equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging in all of our goals, objectives, and recommendations. Admittedly, there's several, I mean, probably pages worth of pieces that do not touch on equity in the plan, but to sort of go through that thought process and really think critically about, you know, are there opportunities to kind of move us in the right direction in, you know, one or more of these different categories was really important to our team, and I think resulted in a much better document. Considering the intended and unintended consequences, I go back to that Amanda Gorman quote, you know, we can intend to do the right things, but if we don't at least do some sort of internal soul searching and you know, almost, I guess, scenario planning of how this might play out and think about the dominoes falling over the next 20 years, we may unintentionally, you know, create new problems. So, you know, thinking of as many of those as possible and taking the time to do that. And then finally, be prepared for pushback and resistance to change. A lot of people benefit from business as usual and maybe have not, well, ultimately, you know, they believe in equity when it comes down to how they can use their property, where investments are going to be made in the community. You know, there's a lot of different reasons that they may resist. And so bake that into the process and be ready for those tough conversations. Susan?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. And yes, just some overall takeaways, just to revisit our 3 cross-cutting areas: gentrification, be proactive, recognize that it can occur, and then be intentional in putting things in place that will prevent displacement. Environmental justice, again, it's all about fairness and avoiding disproportionate impact, seeking equitable investments and results. And community engagement and empowerment, I think empowerment is the operative word. We need to listen to the community, not tell the community. So in other words, we're checking in with the community and we're not just checking that community engagement box. We really, in order to build trust, have to do meaningful community engagement. And then overall, just looking at equity and looking at the work we do as planners with regard to equity, we need to think holistically, again, of all the impacts, both positive and negative. Need to use empathy. I think this might be the most important one. That's the one where we try, I will say, to stand in others' shoes and understand how a new development, a redevelopment, a new community plan, a new highway will affect them. That way we can do good planning. Seek partnerships and be innovative with this, and also break down silos. Think in terms of us as planners also being equity practitioners, and equity practitioners being able to use planning tools as well. Breaking down silos is critical. One last thing before we get to question and answer, we do have another policy guide, APA does, the Legislative and Policy Committee in process, and it's a specific, looking at a specific piece of equity. The Planning for Equity Policy Guide is broad. This policy guide is looking at equitable economic development. So it's isolating one piece. It's looking at how do we invest in communities and invest in areas where we lift up the community and all people, not just a few people. And it's really looking at what the planner's niche is in that regard. Again, we all know we need all people fully functioning to have prosperous communities. Next slide. And so just to wrap up, what you see on the screen is the web address for the Planning for Equity Policy Guide. It's on the apaplanning.org website under policy. Also a web address for where you can look for updates on the new guide. We would love to hear your voice. There'll be things that come out in the future about the guide, asking for input. And then lastly, that's my contact information. If you have questions, need information, please don't hesitate to contact me. And thank you very much. Now, let's go to question and answer. I know we have a limited time, but we'd love to answer your questions.
Great. Thanks, Susan, and thanks everybody on the panel. And also thank you for submitting all these great questions. We're going to have our panelists put their webcams on so you can see them now. We tend to keep them off during the presentation so you can see what they're presenting. You always get comments about that. So, and thanks also for the great questions. Got many. So we'll go for about 20 minutes, I think maybe about 5 minutes over, as we usually do, because we get so many great questions. And I'll just start actually with a comment. We got many comments, Alysia, as you were going through the kind of public involvement process there. And I just wanted to read one of the comments, which is from Harmony Cooper, who said, "This is incredible. I'm super inspired by what you all have done through this planning process. So grateful for what you do and how you do it." So I didn't want to pass that along. That wasn't, I think that was a common sentiment as you were going through all of that. involvement. So actually, then we did get several questions about the cost of that component because of all of the various elements. Is there anything you could share with us about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I will say that we were very fortunate through this process to have a partnership with the Knight Foundation. Charlotte is a Knight city, and they funded much of our engagement, particularly because of the equity lens that we applied to the process and the outcomes. So we were able to fund a lot of that through our partnership with the Knight Foundation. And a lot of our kind of COVID related engagement were funded by CARES Act funding as well for our project.
Thank you. And then John Coleman has been sharing a number of links through the chat, and we'll be posting them on the webinar archive page as well for those interested. I guess another couple questions that we also got about the engagement, and I'll just read one from Jasmine Thomas, who said that these public engagement ideas are great and creative. What method of community engagement did you find the most and least effective?
The most and least. So the most, I think, the drive-in meeting, I think, was surprisingly well attended during COVID. I think I haven't seen, at least not in my career, a public meeting where we've got about 500 people to hear about a long-range plan. So in my mind, that would be the most successful one that we had. The least, I would say, particularly the surveys, maybe the kind of social media surveys that we did. We were thinking, since the digital platform has been really successful in the past year, that our surveys would be as well, but it was hard to get people to respond to those. So we ended up trying incentives and that kind of thing to get more participation for the process. So that worked out, but we had to track and measure to even know, you know, where we needed to pivot in that process. So I would say the surveys, the online surveys.
Okay, thank you. And I guess another, since we're covering this part of the conversation, several questions about how much staff support was used relative to consultants.
Ooh. So I would say Jay and his team are in Denver. So a lot of our engagement, we had to get it going ourselves. But I will say it does help to have a really good consultant team to help strategize, set a really good sound strategy. And then the staff our major role was coming up with the action plan, really assigning the tasks to make sure that we get it done. And we have a really small team. We have about 12, 13 people on our team, but our consultants really made it easy by giving us collaboratively, of course, an engagement strategy that we can implement really, really well within each phase of the process.
Yeah, I would just echo it was a partnership throughout the entire process. I think content-wise, maybe the consultant team did a little more heavy lifting, but it was extremely collaborative throughout. And then in terms of the engagement, it was the staff that did more of the heavy lifting. And on that, the engagement strategy piece, we called it, we had a community engagement plan at the front end of the process that sort of laid out a major framework. And then we used those metrics, and we used, well, some bumps in the road like COVID, you know, to sort of customize and pivot accordingly. So we actually ended up doing a very customized, detailed engagement strategy for each phase that sort of nested within the engagement plan, which I think was a good approach, especially for an effort that lasted 3 years.
Okay. I guess here's a more general question about the Charlotte experience, and that is from Steve Steinhoff, who's asking, did you experience any pushback, and if so, how did you deal with it?
Okay, so I'll start. Jay, you can chime in. There's quite a bit of pushback on the plan as we speak. We have a really key and bold element around how neighborhood diversity and inclusion that talks about expanding single family neighborhoods to allow for duplexes, triplexes, and quads. Now that could be interpreted in other places as eliminating single family zoning, and that's the messaging that's out there. And so there's a lot of angst around that and a lot of conversations about the plans ruining our neighborhoods and why are you doing this? And then there's just a lot of fear around just diversity and inclusion in places that haven't seen much of it, or they might not be interested in it at all. And so that's kind of, the work that Leigh Anne did on the front end that said, here's how our growth, unequitable growth has brought us here today. And this plan seeks to right a lot of those wrongs. And so a lot of what we are hearing about the plan and in opposition of the plan is around taking something away from someone, as opposed to creating equity in the community that meets people where they are and provide opportunity for everyone.
Yeah, I would add in there, I think this topic generally, while of great importance, I think can become pretty wonky. And so while we had been talking about this concept for a long time, people weren't quite understanding what it meant. And so to Alicia's point, some people said, oh, we're eliminating single family zoning. Other people said, we're eliminating single family detached housing altogether. It's not even gonna be a thing anymore. And so kind of thinking about that messaging and how to simplify and tell the story really well and sort of the steps, and whether it's specific to housing like this, we're talking about in this example, or equity and inclusion more generally, I think being really important, kind of breaking that down for people who are not planners in their day-to-day profession. The other thing I thought was kind of surprising to me, but maybe we should have anticipated, was the fact that Charlotte hasn't a plan. I think Leigh Anne and I both cited 40 years. I think it's 45 years actually. People think everything is going to be implemented in the next 6 months, and they're very concerned about that type of change. And so we, need to continue to reiterate that this is a 20-year plus look, for the future of the community, and really helping people understand that.
Okay, thank you. I guess another aspect of this, kind of segueing a little bit, from Peter Swinton, who's saying, I imagine a broad initiative like this would be expensive. How did you get decision makers to understand the value of implementing this in such a broad fashion?
Yeah, we could both answer the question.
Yeah.
I think I would say that I think that the fact that we didn't have a comprehensive plan on the books for so long, it started to impact not just how they did business, but what the community started to think about how we grow and develop. It started to touch people in different ways, not just with the inequities in the community, but also just how we do business and how we serve everyone throughout the community. It started a while ago, but it really started to get hard for people to make clear, transparent, and predictable decisions, so people can have some expectation about their community, their job, their school. Where do I fit in this fast growing city? And that was something that we keep hearing, from people. Where am I in this fast paced growth? And so this plan really, it may not speak to everyone. Every part of it may not speak to everyone, but people should find themselves, everyone should find a piece of this plan for them. And so this process has really been trying to do that. And so decision makers in the community was pretty much fed up with some things and said, we have to think differently about how we make decisions, who's at the table to make them, and how do we create a process that's more transparent and predictable. And the plan does that.
Yeah, the other thing that I would point out is, I think a lot of times in a comprehensive plan effort, most folks probably listening that would, have experiences themselves. The update to the zoning code is an implementation step typically, right? And actually the city of Charlotte started to go down the path of updating the code, introducing this idea of place types to kind of frame future land use. and other investments in the community without comprehensive plan direction. Realizing that it was, a bit antiquated, that we needed to update, that we need to respond to this intense growth we were experiencing over the last, I think at that point, probably 6-7 years. And so it was a little backwards, but ultimately got us to the place where the community said, hey, we need to take the time, take a step back, and create a vision to direct all that other work. So I think that's just noteworthy about this particular process. But while I think that the council and decision makers, city management realized that it was going to be a big effort, where it's probably grown the most actually is bringing in the other departments and other, there's an interesting governmental structure in Charlotte with Mecklenburg County. And so bringing in folks from the county and the city and all these different departments, it's been a lot of time and it's been challenging in a lot of instances, but I think ultimately will result in better implementation of the plan.
To segue a little bit, there's another question. So starting with the topic of reinvestment without displacement is something that I think many communities struggle with. To the panel's point, redevelopment and infill of vulnerable neighborhoods needs to be paired with the various programs and tools to mitigate involuntary displacement. Have there been concrete discussions or implementation items that have or are being discussed to address this issue?
Yeah, I can start if you want, Alysia.
Yeah, go ahead, Jay. You start and I'll finish.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we actually, in the first draft of the plan, which was published, I guess the day that we did that drive-in open house, which was Halloween last fall, there are definitely tools identified as part of that in terms of anti-displacement, equitable community engagement, as we implement the plan. But ultimately, I think through the community conversation, the review of the plan, understanding the scope of the work, there's been an even greater emphasis on, thinking about the potential, intended and unintended consequences, like I used the terminology before. And so we're actually, including in the new draft plan, which will be public on May 17th, an anti-displacement strategy. And there's been a lot of conversations that maybe Alysia can speak to about, how does the community get involved in that, and that it's an ongoing process, not just a kind of one and done, writing of a recommendation or identification of a single tool.
Right, Jay. Yeah, I just think that when we start talking about the plan, and there was a lot of concern about if we're asking for increased density, and particularly in those areas that have vulnerable neighborhoods, that we don't have a strategy or any tools existing, but we currently have a really robust toolbox, absent of our ability to have inclusionary zoning, which we can't, but we have it on our radar to do at some time in the next 20 years, absent of our ability to have impact fees, but we have it in the plan to explore in the next couple of years. What else can we do? And so Jay mentioned the community benefits agreement or some type of participatory development tool that starts to build trust in the development process, and folks can start to see things happen in their neighborhood that matters to them, that helps, and also providing more funding for home ownership opportunities, downset payment assistance programs, creating and expanding the opportunity for tax abatement programs or tax relief programs. Those are some of the things that are within the plan that we can continue to build on as well.
And if I could, I'd like to add one thing to that, just to take it up a level even, is I think first and foremost with any development that comes across your desk or redevelopment that comes across your desk is recognizing from the get-go the potential for that to happen. Because once the development is beginning or gets very far down the road, it gets very hard to go back and put the genie back in the bottle. So it's recognizing early on. And then another avenue, I love the tools that Alysia and Jay have mentioned because it's fascinating to me. I think innovation abounds, and I think that's huge. But one of the other things is to focus on, working with the nonprofit world and the housing authority world and the NGO world in a public-private way. to see, for instance, land trusts that can be put in place and things like that to actually preserve the land before it's too far down the road.
Thanks, Susan. Next question is a little bit more general, which is how do we include equity in current planning and development review?
Leigh Anne,
Take that one, Leigh Anne?
Well, can you repeat the question, Michael?
Sure. It's how do we include equity in current planning and development review?
Well, that's an excellent question, and there's actually a lot of work being done right now, particularly on that topic through APA. So I think that I think it's a challenging one. I think the first step is you need probably to have a planning effort that helps set the policy direction and the implementation items to guide the code adjustments that you need to deal with equity. I don't think diving into a code revision process without doing that planning and engagement work first is really going to serve profitable. I think that's part of what happened in Charlotte. They were moving forward with updating their UDO, and I think everybody realized that at a certain way through, they needed to put on the brakes and back up and say, hey, we actually need a comprehensive plan that sets out clear policy direction on a lot of different fronts that we just don't understand what direction we should be heading in this point and what we should be doing. So I think that that's the first step, is you really need that policy guidance to help identify the specific regulations that you need to be looking at and adjusting within your code. So I think that, there are a variety of different things, having more flexibility in terms of residential unit types. We've talked about that. Looking at how businesses are impacted. So we talk a lot about gentrification and displacement with respect to residents and housing, but we don't always think about how it affects businesses. And that's also an important one to think about. And so, are there ways that you can use zoning to really support, smaller local businesses, for example? I think there are a whole host of different issues, but again, I think having that policy direction to guide the revisions to the regulations really need to happen first.
Yeah, but one other quick thought on that. One of the things that we're actually grappling with in the review and adoption process is kind of business as usual in Charlotte involves a lot of kind of negotiation through the development process. And I think for the most part, there's really good people in those decision-making roles and, have great intent. But there's no guarantee that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that, it's going to be that same ethic, same value set. So codifying some of that, I think, is really great. And so some of the pieces of the UDO that have already been, particularly the zoning pieces around transit-oriented development that have already been issued or are published and adopted, actually include bonus menus. So prior to even establishing a community benefits agreement sort of a framework, this idea of including bonus menus that sort of bake in public benefits of different types to kind of administer the negotiation process, I think, in a more predictable way, could be one of those aspects of current planning where we can bake in equity in a more meaningful way.
Great, thanks.
If I can just underscore really quickly what Leigh Anne said about the comprehensive plan. I think sometimes we think of it as it's an aspirational document or a goal-oriented document, but it really is so important because it really does set the policy, and it's created, and I think Leigh Anne said this as well, with input from the community. So what that means is that community or political will going forward is there because the community voice is in that plan that set the goals and the vision for the community. So it's the best place to start.
I'd like to go a couple more minutes because I want to ask a few more of the general questions from earlier on and maybe touch upon a couple questions for Susan on the policy guide itself. So here's one. You mentioned, and this I think was earlier, Jay, when you were going through some of the material. So the you mentioned understanding the history of your community and preparing for the comprehensive plan. Did you or would you recommend conducting some research on some of the discriminatory discriminatory practices in the past that may have occurred so you can address those actions head on during your equity outreach process?
Yeah, 100%. Prior to, and for the sake of time, we didn't get into this at all, actually, but there was a lot of work that was done prior to us being involved. So prior to I think the writing of the RFP, prior to a solicitation, the interview process, all of that, there was design sprints, there were local community conversations and kind of town hall sessions to really understand what were those critical issues for the community. There was a deeper dive into data, both by staff as well as in partnership with UNC Charlotte, University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And so a lot of those issues, I think, were framed at a high level, and that allowed us to write a scope of work that really, sort of targeted this versus, I think it was actually in our interview for the project, we talked about some of our work in Denver, for example. And in Denver, equity does have a major component, but ended up being one section of the plan. And because of, you work on something for months and years in some cases, there's a lot of water in the bridge, it wasn't necessarily infused throughout. And so I think doing that upfront work prior to even, beginning the official comprehensive plan process, I think can be extremely beneficial. And then, as we said, kind of rethinking the typical planning process as well. How do you integrate that equity inclusion throughout the rest of the process too?
Thanks, Jay. Another question here is, what were some of the variables used to develop the vulnerability and displacement index, and how were they quantified?
So can you say that one more time, Michael? Defining the equity or the vulnerability displacement index?
The question was, what were some of the variables used to develop the vulnerability and displacement index, and how were they quantified?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few different approaches to vulnerability displacement. Seattle has a great index. Denver has a good index that I'm aware of. I believe Minneapolis. So I think it's going to be different everywhere, but some of the common things to look at is voter participation, actually a common one that we ended up not using. Income, education, race, ethnicity, and then folks have brought up age. And so we actually included age in our equity metrics, whereas we didn't in the beginning of the process. So thinking about seniors and their vulnerability to displacement as they may be on fixed incomes, wanting to age in place. And then I think one of the other aspects that came up, which we did not include, but I would definitely, consider for your community and see, if you're, as you measure it, as you begin to map that, if there are disparities, would be the disabled community. And so that's been brought up actually in the review and adoption process as maybe something to consider, at least in the future. So with those equity metrics, we needed to, one, see where there were differences, two, see where there was actually good data, and data that was going to be updated relatively frequently. So in the revised draft plan, we intend to identify future metrics and data to consider when the data is available. But those are a few that come to mind.
Okay, thanks, Jay. In the interest of time, I guess this will be the last question, but thanks to everybody who submitted them. I mean, it was really excellent questions on this. We've been looking forward to doing the session with APA on the equity policy guide and the application. So I think it was both interesting in terms of setting up the framework and then seeing how it's being applied in a real world example that's also current. So that's excellent. I guess I'll direct this one to Susan, and that is a question. Is there any intent on revisiting the AICP Code of Ethics to incorporate stronger language and a more prevalent tie to racial and economic equity? The current Code of Ethics was last updated in 2016 and leaves much to be desired in terms of active language and advocating for the underrepresented, underserved community.
To answer that question, I think that's a real possibility. I can't speak for the AICP Commission at this point, but it's certainly on the radar screen because it's a topic of discussion, certainly. In addition to that, and to address that in some ways at least, is that coming up in 2022, there'll be a requirement for an equity credits, just as there are for law and for ethics. So there's really I think a real focus on the need to address ethics and equity in the same vein, and to account for them accordingly. And I do think it's fully recognized that that there is opportunity there to go back and revisit the code. When that might happen, I'm not sure. But again, we do have the ethics CM credits, the equity CM credits that's coming into play next year.
Great. And Liz Lang of APA, who's actually in the council with us, is mentioning that that's happening. But and other core documents, including the exam, are being updated. So that's good information. So with that, I think I'm just going to go ahead and ask for some closing thoughts from everybody. And I guess why don't we end with you, Susan, and maybe we can go backwards. I actually thought we'd go in the order of presenters, but since so much of the Q&A was about the public involvement process, why don't I start with you, Alysia, and I'll go into Leigh Anne, Jay, and
well, thanks again for the invitation to talk about our project in Charlotte. We're definitely a growing city, but in terms of just closing remarks for engagement, just always think about and ask that essential question about who's not in the room, and how can you best meet them where they are to get them there so their voice is heard. To have equitable outcomes, you have to have equitable input. So it's important to have those people at the table to have the outcomes that you like to see in your city.
So I guess my final thoughts are that comprehensive planning is such a critical component to making sure we're dealing with equity in our communities. And if we've done our job in terms of engaging the community, the plan itself will be really a compact between the community and the elected officials and staff. And so I think it's a really important document that's going to guide a lot of efforts. And looking at your current policies at the start of that project is really important to kind of have a point to be jumping off from and to be building momentum from through that process.
Yeah, and I hit on this a little bit, I think, in maybe one of the responses to the questions, but I think, we did, and Alysia highlight a lot of really cool tools and events and different things. We did a great community engagement process, I think, but it's still, there's people who are like, oh, I didn't know this was happening, just a week ago, right? Like, they're like, oh, I didn't even know we were doing a comprehensive plan, or this is brand new to me. I didn't have an opportunity to engage. And so I think, thinking about sort of normalizing different ideas and concepts as early as possible, simplifying messaging, storytelling is going to be really important to ensuring that equity, inclusion, diversity, and belonging do become part of our day-to-day in all of our planning work. Susan?
Yeah, I'd like, first of all, just to say thank you to Alysia and Jay and Leigh Anne for sharing their work in Charlotte with us. It's been a great learning experience, and it's really heartening to me to see how the work of equity is really progressing. That and the answer to the poll questions we asked today, also very heartening, and it's really so nice to see. I'll just leave with a couple of thoughts. One, in thinking equity, think about centering people. That's really the most important thing. People first, outcomes second. And then lastly, be empathetic. Keep empathy in the forefront. As much as is possible, stand in others' shoes and really try to understand how the impacts of the work that we do affect everyone. And again, thank you all so much. This has been great.
Great. Thank you, Susan, and thanks everybody for being on the panel today. This will conclude our webinar, Equity in Policy and Practice, Addressing Past Inequities and Planning for the Future. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to our panelists for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today. to Liz Lang of the American Planning Association, who helped to coordinate this session, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars. And with that, I wish you a great day and a great weekend.